I'm Emily, 32 female. I live in the house I grew up in, a two-story colonial that has felt less like a home and more like a beautifully decorated cage for the last 10 years of my life. I'm a librarian, a profession that suits my quiet nature, but the silence I enjoy among the stacks is a universe away from the oppressive quiet of this house, which is always waiting for the next medical emergency to shatter it. I live with my mother, Carol, a woman whose love feels conditional, whose care is a currency, and whose health is a weapon she has wielded with surgical precision to keep me tethered to her side. For over a decade, my life has followed a suffocatingly predictable cycle. I work, I save, I dream of a small apartment of my own, and just as I'm about to take the leap, my mother's fragile health plummets. It's a pattern as reliable as the seasons. The time I found a perfect studio apartment downtown, she was struck with a bout of vertigo so severe she couldn't be left alone for a week. The time I was offered a promotion that would have required a move to a neighboring state, she developed heart palpitations that landed her in the emergency room overnight. Each time, the doctors found nothing definitive, chalking it up to stress or anxiety. And each time, I would unpack my boxes, cancel my plans, and sink back into the quicksand of guilt. My boyfriend, James, is the anchor in the storm of my life, but even anchors can be strained to their breaking point. He's a financial analyst, a man who sees the world in patterns, logic, and predictable outcomes. He understands love and loyalty, but he cannot comprehend the intricate web of emotional manipulation my mother has woven around me. He has been patient for 3 years, holding my hand through every canceled date because Mom had a fall, and every postponed weekend trip because her blood pressure was acting up. But lately, I've seen a new kind of weariness in his eyes, a frustration that his logical world cannot reconcile with the emotional chaos of mine. We love each other, and we want to build a life together, but that future feels like a distant shore I can never quite reach, with my mother's manufactured crises being the relentless tide that always pulls me back. For over a decade, her phantom illnesses had been the bars of my cage. But a single, careless mistake on her part, a tiny loose thread in her elaborate tapestry of deceit, was about to give me the key. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. To understand how I got here, you have to understand the foundation on which my prison was built. My mother, Carol, was a nurse for nearly 40 years. It wasn't just a job for her, it was her entire identity. She was the calm in the crisis, the knowledgeable authority, the compassionate caregiver. When she retired, she didn't just lose a profession, she lost her stage. And so, she found a new one, her own body. Her life became a long-running drama of symptoms, syndromes, and near misses, and I was cast in the permanent supporting role of the devoted, worried daughter. My sense of duty was the cement that held it all together. My father passed away when I was in college, a sudden heart attack that left no room for goodbyes. The grief was immense, but Carol's grief was performative. She wore it like a shroud, and embedded in her mourning was an unspoken accusation. If only someone had been paying closer attention, he might still be here. That unspoken sentiment became the operating principle of my life. I would pay attention. I would be there. I would not fail her the way we had, apparently, failed him. A typical day in our home began not with an alarm clock, but with the sound of my mother's sighing from across the hall, a soft, weary sound that was my cue to rise. My first task was to prepare her breakfast, a meal dictated by the ailment of the day. If her joints were inflamed, it was an anti-inflammatory smoothie. If her stomach was delicate, it was dry toast and weak tea. I'd bring it to her on a tray, and she would pick at it while giving me a detailed rundown of her nightly sufferings. "I barely slept a wink, Emily," she'd say, pressing a hand to her temple. "This headache, it's a pressure, not like a normal one." She spoke a fluent second language, the language of medical nuance. As a retired nurse, she knew all the right words. She never just had a stomachache, she had gastric distress. She didn't get dizzy, she experienced episodes of postural hypotension. This medical jargon was her armor, making her claims sound official and unassailable. Who was I, a librarian, to question a seasoned medical professional about her own body? After her breakfast and a lengthy discussion about which of her many pains was most prominent, I would help her with her more Ning regimen. This involved laying out a rainbow of vitamins and supplements: fish oil for her joints, CoQ10 for her heart, magnesium for her nerves. She had a pill for everything, yet I rarely saw her take any actual prescription medication, a fact that seemed odd in hindsight but was just part of the background noise at the time. My life was a series of interruptions. I'd be in the middle of reading a book, and she would call my name from the other room, her voice thin and reedy. "Emily, dear, could you fetch my heating pad? My back is seizing up again." I'd be on the phone with James, making plans, and her voice would drift down the hall. "Is that James? Tell him I hope he understands, but I'm feeling a bit faint. I don't think you should go out tonight." The guilt was instantaneous and effective. How could I go enjoy a movie when my mother was on the verge of fainting? It was selfish. It was reckless, so I would stay. My best friend, Sarah, was the only person who saw through the performance. A paralegal by trade, her mind was trained to spot inconsistencies and question narratives. We'd meet for coffee on my lunch breaks, and those 45 minutes were my only taste of unfiltered reality. "So, what was it this week?" she asked one afternoon, stirring her latte with a cynical smirk. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Sudden chest pains on Tuesday, the day I was supposed to go with James to look at that apartment. And a crippling migraine yesterday, when he wanted to take me out for our anniversary. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "Emily, does she not realize we live in the age of the internet? A crippling migraine doesn't just vanish the second her favorite game show comes on." I saw her commenting on a neighbor's Facebook photos right when she was supposedly in a dark room with a cloth over her eyes. I flinched, a reflexive defense rising in me. "She has good moments and bad moments." "No," Sarah countered, her voice firm but kind. "She has convenient moments. She's a retired nurse, Em. She knows exactly which symptoms are scary enough to keep you home but not serious enough to be disproven by a doctor. Has it ever occurred to you that none of these emergencies ever result in a diagnosis? It's always stress or exhaustion. They're phantom illnesses, and you're the ghost tethered to them." I wanted to be angry with her, to defend my mother's honor, but a part of me knew she was right. I had seen the inconsistencies. I had noticed the miraculous recoveries that coincided with me canceling my plans. But acknowledging that truth felt like a betrayal far greater than any of my mother's deceptions. To admit my mother was manipulating me would be to admit that the last decade of my life, the sacrifices, the missed opportunities, the constant worry, was all built on a foundation of lies. It was easier to believe she was sick than to believe she was cruel. Duty is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs you to the reality of your own unhappiness. I felt bound to her, not just by love, but by a carefully constructed sense of obligation that had become my identity. I wasn't Emily, the librarian who loved classic literature and dreamed of traveling to Scotland. I was Carol's daughter, her caregiver, the one who stayed. And in our quiet, suffocating house, that was the only role she would allow me to play. The breaking point began, as most things in my life did, with a spark of hope. After months of searching online and covertly driving past listings, James and I found it, a small, one-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a charming brick building with a little balcony that overlooked a park. It was perfect. It was affordable. And most importantly, it was ours. James, ever the pragmatist, had run the numbers a dozen times. With my savings and his steady income, we could manage it easily. This time felt different. My resolve was stronger, my desperation deeper. I was 32 years old, and I had never spent a single night in a home that was truly my own. I was done letting my life be a footnote in my mother's medical textbook. We signed the lease and paid the first month's rent and security deposit without telling her. For the first time, I had made a decision about my future that wasn't contingent on her approval or her health. It was terrifying and exhilarating. For a week, I lived a double life. By day, I was the dutiful daughter, fetching slippers and brewing herbal teas. By night, I was a woman planning her escape. I packed boxes in the dead of night, labeling them with vague terms like seasonal or donations, and stacking them in the back of my closet. Each folded sweater and wrapped coffee mug was a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration of independence. James was my co-conspirator, his steady presence a balm to my frayed nerves. "We're doing this, Em," he'd whisper over the phone, his voice a lifeline. "No matter what happens, we're doing this. I'll be there on moving day. I'll write every single box myself if I have to." His certainty was the armor I wore as I prepared for the inevitable confrontation. I decided to tell her on a Sunday afternoon, a time I naively believed would be calm and neutral. I made her favorite lunch, tomato soup and grilled cheese, and sat down with her at the kitchen table. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "Mom," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "James and I have something exciting to tell you. We've found an apartment together." I rushed on before she could react, the words tumbling out in a pre-rehearsed stream. "It's only 20 minutes away, and it's a wonderful, secure building. I'll be able to come over several times a week, and you can call me anytime, absolutely anytime. Nothing will change, except that I'll have my own space." For a moment, she just stared at me, her spoon hovering over her soup. Her expression was a carefully crafted masterpiece of hurt. Her lower lip trembled. A single, perfect tear welled in the corner of her eye and slid down her cheek. "Your own space," she repeated, her voice a wounded whisper. "As if this hasn't been your space. As if I've made you feel unwelcome here." "No, that's not it at all," I pleaded, already feeling the familiar coils of guilt tightening around my chest. It's time. I'm 32. I love James, and we want to start our life together." She pushed her soup away, her appetite apparently vanishing. "I see. So this is it. You're just going to abandon me. After everything I've done for you, after I dedicated my life to raising you on my own. I suppose I'll just have to manage. Alone." The word alone hung in the air, a loaded weapon aimed directly at my heart. I tried to reason with her, but it was like arguing with a fog. My logic was useless against her emotional onslaught. Seeing that the guilt trip wasn't landing with its usual force, she escalated. She pressed her hand to her chest, her breathing becoming shallow and ragged. Oh my," she gasped, her eyes widening in theatrical panic. "My heart, it's skipping beats. I can't catch my breath." I stood up, my own heart beginning to race in conditioned response. "Mom, what is it? Should I call Dr. Evans?" No doctor," she wheezed, leaning forward and gripping the edge of the table. "It's just the shock. The thought of being in this big house, all by myself. My vision, it's going blurry at the edges, Emily." This was her magnum opus, her greatest performance to date. And then came the finale. Her eyes rolled back in her head, her body went limp, and she slid silently from her chair onto the floor in a delicate heap. For a split second, I was frozen, caught between decades of ingrained panic and a new, chilling sliver of doubt. But the panic won. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed 911, my voice cracking as I told the dispatcher my mother had collapsed. The next few minutes were a blur of sirens, medics, and questions. They strapped her to a gurney, her eyes fluttering open just enough to give me a weak, guilt-inducing smile. As they were wheeling her out the door, James's car pulled into the driveway. He ran up the walkway, his face etched with concern, which immediately hardened into a mask of weary resignation as he saw the ambulance. He looked from my mother's triumphant, martyred face on the gurney to the half-packed boxes visible through the living room window. He didn't have to say a word. His eyes said everything. "Your move, Emily." Once again, my bid for freedom had been checkmated by a convenient collapse. The emergency room was my mother's throne room. Propped up on a gurney in a curtained-off cubicle, she held court, recounting her dramatic collapse to any nurse or doctor who would listen. She was the star of her own medical drama, and I was the beleaguered supporting actress. James stood beside me, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He was silent, but his presence was a loud, clear judgment on the entire charade. He watched as the nurses hooked her up to an EKG, the rhythmic beeping of the machine the only sound in the tense space between us. He observed as they drew blood and took her blood pressure. And he noted, as I did, that all her vitals were, as the nurse cheerfully put it, rock solid. By a stroke of luck, or perhaps cosmic irony, the doctor on call that evening was our longtime family physician, Dr. Evans. He was a kind, older man who had treated my sniffles as a child and had managed my mother's various conditions for years. He had a gentle bedside manner, and I was beginning to realize a deep-seated inability to see my mother as anything other than a frail, anxious woman. He ran a full battery of tests. He listened to her heart, checked her reflexes, and sent her blood work for urgent analysis. After a few hours of waiting, he returned with a clipboard and a placid smile. "Well, Carol," he said, patting her hand, "the good news is your heart is as strong as an ox. The EKG is perfect and your blood work came back clean, no signs of any cardiac event." My mother managed to look both relieved and disappointed. "But doctor," she said, her voice weak, "what happened? I felt like I was slipping away." Dr. Evans nodded sympathetically. "It sounds to me like you had a classic vasovagal syncope episode. Basically, an emotional trigger in this case, the stress from Emily's news, caused a sudden drop in your heart rate and blood pressure, and you fainted. It's quite common, though very frightening when it happens." He was giving her a plausible, medical-sounding out. He was validating her experience while simultaneously confirming that nothing was physically wrong. He then turned to me. "The best thing for her is rest and a low-stress environment." The implication was clear. A low-stress environment meant no talk of moving out. Before discharging her, Dr. Evans scribbled on his prescription pad. "Carol, I think a lot of this is rooted in anxiety," he said gently. "I'm going to prescribe a very low dose of lorazepam. It's just to take the edge off when you feel overwhelmed. It should help prevent another episode like this." My mother accepted the prescription with a grateful nod, as if it were a medal for her suffering. The drive home was silent and heavy. The next few days were a masterclass in passive aggression. My packed boxes were a silent accusation in the corner of my room. My mother shuffled around the house in her bathrobe, sighing heavily whenever I entered a room, a constant, non-verbal reminder of the stress I had put her through. My new apartment, my new life, felt like an impossible dream. The lease was signed, but I felt more trapped than ever. The discovery, the moment the first crack appeared in the wall of her deception, came a week later. It was a Tuesday. My mother called me at work at the library. "Emily, dear," she cooed, her voice sounding remarkably robust. "Could you be a doll and pick up my refills on your way home? I'm feeling a bit too drained to go out." Annoyed but resigned, I agreed. I stopped at the local pharmacy, a small, family-owned place where I knew the staff by name. The head pharmacist, a warm woman named Mrs. Gable, greeted me with a smile. "Hi, Emily, just picking up for your mom?" she asked, already turning to retrieve the order. She returned with a stapled white paper bag. "Here are Carol's usuals," she said, scanning the items. "And that new one for anxiety Dr. Evans prescribed last week. It's funny, you know. With all the powerful heart medication she's on, you'd think they'd be more cautious about adding a sedative to the mix." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I froze, my hand hovering over the bag. "I'm sorry," I said slowly, my mind racing. What heart medication?" Mrs. Gable looked at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. "You know, her regulars. The atorvastatin for her cholesterol, the lisinopril for her blood pressure. She's been on them for years." A cold dread washed over me. I had laid out my mother's supplements every morning for years. I had seen her bottle of emergency aspirin. But I had never, not once, seen her take a pill for cholesterol or blood pressure. The medications she described were daily drugs, not emergency ones. "Mrs. Gable," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "I handle my mother's daily pills. I've never seen those." The pharmacist's friendly demeanor shifted to one of professional concern. She tapped a few keys on her computer, her eyes scanning the screen. "Well, that's very strange," she murmured. "According to our records, we've been filling these for her, like clockwork, every 90 days for the last 8 years. My heart hammered against my ribs. It didn't make any sense. Unless, could you possibly print out a full medication history for me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "For our records, Dr. Evans wants me to keep a comprehensive file." It was a lie, but it came out easily. Mrs. Gable nodded, her expression sympathetic, and a minute later, she handed me a sheaf of papers. I walked out of the pharmacy in a daze, the white bag feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. In my car, I unfolded the printout. It was a timeline of my own captivity, written in the cold, clinical language of prescriptions and refills. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was holding the truth in my hands. The drive home was surreal. The world outside my car windows, the familiar streets, the setting sun, the people walking their dogs, seemed to belong to a different reality. My reality was now contained on 3 sheets of paper filled with medication names, dosage amounts, and most importantly, dates. When I got home, my mother was in the living room, watching television, a picture of serene fragility. "Did you get my things, dear?" she asked without looking away from the screen. "Yes, Mom," I replied, my voice flat. I dropped the bag on the kitchen counter and went straight to my room, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I spread the pharmacy records across my desk. Atorvastatin, lisinopril, metoprolol, a whole cocktail of drugs for chronic conditions she claimed to battle daily, yet I had never seen her ingest a single one. Then I saw the fill dates, and a cold, horrifying clarity began to settle over me. I knew I needed help. I needed a second pair of eyes, someone who wasn't drowning in a decade of guilt. I called Sarah. "Can you come over?" I whispered into the phone. "Something's happened, something's wrong." An hour later, she was sitting on my bed, her paralegal's gaze sharp and focused as she examined the documents. I had also pulled out a stack of my old journals and planners, the ones that chronicled my life's biggest milestones and biggest disappointments. "Okay," Sarah said, tapping a date on the pharmacy printout with her pen. Lisinopril, a new prescription for high blood pressure. Filled on March 12, 2015. What happened on that day, Em? I flipped through my 2015 journal, my stomach twisting into a knot. I found the entry. "I got the acceptance letter," I read aloud, my voice hollow, "for the master's program in library science at the university in Boston." I was so excited. I told her that night. I remembered that night vividly. My excitement had been met with a pale face and a trembling hand pressed to her chest. She spent the next week in bed, complaining of dizziness and a racing heart, forcing me to postpone my plans indefinitely. I had never reapplied. Sarah drew a line connecting the pharmacy record to my journal entry. "Coincidence number 1, she said grimly. "Let's find another." We kept going, and with each new discovery, the coincidences piled up into an undeniable mountain of deceit. A prescription for high-dose statins to treat skyrocketing cholesterol, filled on September 5, 2018. I checked my planner. It was 2 days after my then-boyfriend, Daniel, had proposed to me. My mother's subsequent health scare had been so severe and prolonged that it had created an irreparable rift in our relationship, with Daniel accusing me of being unable to leave her and me accusing him of being heartless. We broke up 2 months later. A new prescription for metoprolol, another blood pressure medication. January 22, 2021. The day after I had a second interview for a head librarian position in a city 3 hours away. She declaimed to have a mini-stroke that evening, and I'd withdrawn my application the next day, telling the library board that I couldn't leave due to a family medical emergency. The pattern was sickeningly clear and brutally consistent. Every major step I took toward building a life of my own, a new school, a new love, a new job, was immediately met with the invention of a new, life-threatening illness, legitimized by a prescription she never intended to take. She wasn't just manipulating me emotionally. She was creating a fraudulent paper trail to back up her lies. She would go to Dr. Evans, describe a textbook set of symptoms she'd likely read about in one of her old nursing manuals, and walk out with a prescription. That prescription became her proof, her weapon. She could wave the bottle in my face, a tangible symbol of her suffering and my obligation. But how did she fake the symptoms? I asked Sarah, my mind reeling. The dizzy spells, the fainting, I saw it happen. Sarah pulled out her phone and started typing. She was a nurse for 40 years, Em. She knows the system, and she knows physiology. She turned the phone screen toward me. She had searched for ways to mimic symptoms of high blood pressure and heart problems. The results were terrifyingly simple. Hyperventilation can induce dizziness, tingling, and a racing heartbeat, she read. Certain over-the-counter herbal supplements in high doses can cause palpitations. Dehydration can lead to a sudden drop in blood pressure. It would be easy for her to create a temporary, convincing crisis right when she needed one. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conspiracy filling the small room. My mother hadn't just lied, she had orchestrated my life. She had been the puppet master, pulling my strings with fear and guilt, ensuring I never strayed too far from the stage she had built for herself. The love I thought was protecting her was actually enabling her. The sacrifices I thought I was making for her health were actually offerings to her narcissism. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place later that night. Driven by a grim new resolve, I waited until she was asleep. Then I crept into her bedroom and quietly opened her closet. In the very back, tucked away under a pile of old blankets, was a shoebox. I lifted the lid. It was filled with pill bottles, dozens of them, all with my mother's name on them. The lisinopril, the atorvastatin, the metoprolol. I opened one. It was completely full. I opened another. Also full. They were all full. She had been filling the prescriptions religiously for years, creating her arsenal, but never taking a single pill. It was the ultimate proof. Holding the cold, plastic bottles in my hands, the last vestiges of my doubt evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard anger. She hadn't been sick. She had been cruel, and my life had been her longest, most successful prescription. The anger was a fire in my veins. For 2 days, I went through the motions, a silent storm raging inside me. I made my mother her tea, I fluffed her pillows, I listened to her litany of complaints, but every word she spoke was now filtered through the lens of her deception. Her sighs of pain sounded like accusations, and her requests for help felt like the tightening of a leash. The urge to scream, to throw the shoebox of full pill bottles at her feet and demand an explanation, was immense. But I knew that a direct confrontation would be useless. She was a master of deflection. She would cry, she would deny, she would clutch her chest and manufacture another crisis, and I would once again be cast as the cruel, ungrateful daughter who was stressing her sick mother. I would lose and she would win. Again. Sarah's logical, paralegal mind was my salvation. "You can't just accuse her," she told me during an urgent late-night phone call. "You have to build an airtight case. You need to present the evidence in a way that leaves her with no escape route. No room for lies, no opportunity for a dramatic collapse. You have to take away her power, and her greatest power is her audience's sympathy." That's when the plan began to form. It couldn't be an ambush. It had to be a meticulously staged event, disguised as an act of love and concern. My revenge wouldn't be loud and explosive. It would be quiet, clinical, and devastatingly effective. The stage would be our own living room, her favorite theater. The event would be a family health support meeting. The goal was twofold: to expose her lies so completely that she could never use them again, and to do it in front of the very people whose sympathy she fed on, thereby cutting off her supply. The guest list was critical. First, Dr. Evans. His presence was non-negotiable. He was the unwitting enabler of her deception, the man who had legitimized her phantom illnesses with his prescription pad. He needed to see the truth. I called his office and left a message with his nurse, framing the meeting as a daughter's desperate attempt to get a handle on her mother's complex and deteriorating health. "I've gathered all of her medication records," I explained, "and I'm deeply concerned about the potential for negative interactions. I was hoping Dr. Evans could help us create a comprehensive and safe care plan." It was the perfect bait for a conscientious doctor. He agreed immediately. Next, I needed her audience. I invited her 2 closest friends, Martha and Joan, a pair of neighborhood widows who orbited my mother like sympathetic satellites. They were the primary consumers of her tales of woe, clucking their tongues in sympathy over tea and validating her every complaint. Their presence would ensure that the fallout from the exposure would extend beyond our front door, dismantling the public persona she had so carefully constructed. I told them I was organizing a meeting to better support my mother, and that I needed their loving presence to show her she wasn't alone. They were thrilled to participate in such a noble endeavor. James and Sarah were my co-conspirators, my strategic team. James, with his analyst's mind, helped me organize the evidence into a clear, undeniable timeline. We created a PowerPoint presentation, a cold, corporate tool for a deeply personal war. On one side of each slide was a key date from my life: accepted to master's program, engagement to Daniel, job offer in new city, apartment lease signed with James. On the other side was the corresponding pharmacy record, new prescription filled, lisinopril, dosage increased, atorvastatin. The correlation was stark and damning. Sarah, meanwhile, coached me on my delivery. "You cannot be angry," she instructed, pacing my bedroom as we rehearsed. "You must be nothing but concerned. Your tone has to be one of a loving daughter who has stumbled upon some deeply worrying information and is simply seeking clarity for the sake of her mother's well-being. You are not the prosecutor. You are the concerned party. You're not accusing her of lying. You're highlighting dangerous inconsistencies in her care." The final piece of the plan was the most crucial. It was our checkmate move, the one that would strip away her final defense. James made a few calls and gathered a collection of glossy brochures from the area's most highly rated assisted living facilities. Places with 24/7 nursing staff, on-site doctors, and emergency response systems. If my mother was truly as frail and sick as she had pretended to be for a decade, then moving to a facility that could constant medical supervision was the only logical, responsible solution. It was the perfect trap. Her entire defense rested on the reality of her illness. By offering her the perfect solution for that illness, I was calling her bluff on the grandest scale imaginable. The stage was set. The evidence was compiled. The actors were invited. All that was left was for the star of the show to take her final bow. The day of the meeting, I moved with a strange, calm detachment. The Emily who would have been riddled with anxiety and guilt was gone, replaced by a woman with a singular, chilling focus. I arranged the living room chairs in a semicircle, prepared a pot of tea, and set out a plate of cookies, creating an atmosphere of care and civility that belied the surgical strike I was about to launch. My mother was in her element. She sat in her favorite armchair, dressed in a soft lavender cardigan, looking pale and interesting. She basked in the attention of her friends, Martha and Joan, who were already fussing over her, patting her hand and telling her how brave she was. When Dr. Evans arrived, carrying his leather medical bag, her performance kicked into high gear. She greeted him with a weak but grateful smile, sighing as she recounted her latest spell. "Oh, doctor, thank you for coming," she said, her voice breathy. "My Emily worries so, but she's such a good girl. I don't know what I'd do without her." I felt a flash of white-hot anger, but I pushed it down, channeling it into icy resolve. James arrived last, setting up a small projector on the coffee table with quiet efficiency. He gave my hand a quick, reassuring squeeze as he passed, his presence a silent promise of support. I took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all so much for being here," I started, my voice steady and filled with the carefully rehearsed warmth Sarah had coached me on. "I asked you here because, as you all know, Mom's health has been a significant concern for a long time. I love her more than anything, and I'm worried that we're not managing her care as well as we could be. So, I've spent the last week gathering all of her records to get a clearer picture." My mother beamed, looking around the room as if to say, "See what a devoted daughter I have." I clicked the first slide of the presentation into view. It was a simple title, "A Timeline of Care." "I started by creating a timeline," I explained, "to track Mom's health crises against her prescriptions." I clicked to the next slide. On the left, in bold letters, it said, "March 2015, accepted to master's program in Boston." On the right, an image of the pharmacy record, new prescription, lisinopril, high blood pressure. A small frown creased my mother's forehead. Martha and Joan exchanged confused glances. Dr. Evans leaned forward slightly, his professional curiosity piqued. I clicked again. September 2018, engagement to Daniel. On the right, new prescription, atorvastatin, high cholesterol. I continued, my voice remaining calm and level as I narrated the story of my life through the lens of her medical records, the job offer and the beta blockers. The plan to move out with James and the emergency room visit for syncope. With each slide, the atmosphere in the room grew colder. The looks of sympathy on her friends' faces were slowly being replaced by expressions of shock and dawning comprehension. My mother's pale, fragile mask began to crack. Her breathing became quicker, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. "Emily, what is the meaning of this?" she snapped, her voice losing its frail quaver and gaining a hard, defensive edge. This is my private medical information. I'm just trying to understand the pattern, Mom, I said gently, because the most confusing part of all is this. I clicked to the final, damning slide. It was a photo I had taken of the shoebox, overflowing with the full, unopened bottles of pills. The room was utterly silent. Dr. Evans stared at the screen, his face a mixture of disbelief and dawning professional horror. He was looking at years of medical fraud. Martha and Joan stared at my mother, their mouths slightly agape. They were looking at a liar. All of these prescriptions for all of these life-threatening conditions were filled, I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room. But none of them were ever taken. For years. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but for the first time in her life she had no script. She looked cornered, her eyes darting between the horrified faces of her audience. This was the moment. The moment she would normally clutch her chest, gasp for air, and collapse. But she couldn't. Not now. A medical emergency now would be nothing short of a confession. I moved on to my final act. Clearly, I said, my voice thick with false sincerity, we have been underestimating the severity of your condition. An illness that presents such dramatic, life-threatening symptoms, but is somehow resistant to all these powerful cations, well, it's far too serious for me to manage on my own here at home. I walked over to the side table and picked up the stack of glossy brochures. I handed one to Dr. Evans and one to each of her friends before placing the last one gently in my mother's lap. So I took the liberty of researching some local assisted living communities, I announced to the stunned room. These places are wonderful. They have 24/7 medical staff, emergency call buttons in every room, and on-site physicians. If you're truly this sick, Mom, then this is the only responsible option. It's the only way I can have peace of mind knowing you are truly safe. The trap had been sprung. Her eyes fell to the brochure in her lap. It featured a picture of smiling, white-haired seniors playing bingo. She was staring at her own bluff, called in spectacular fashion. If she was sick, this was her future. If she wasn't, her lie was laid bare for all to see. She looked up at me, her face pale with fury, not illness. And in that moment, sitting in her armchair, surrounded by the wreckage of her own lies, my mother had never looked healthier in her entire life. The silence that followed my pronouncement was the most profound silence I had ever experienced in that house. It was a vacuum, devoid of sympathy, devoid of excuses. It was the sound of a decade-long performance coming to an abrupt, unceremonious end. My mother, Carol, the woman who could conjure a cardiac event out of thin air, sat perfectly still, her chest rising and falling with the steady, rhythmic breaths of a perfectly healthy, incredibly angry person. Her face, usually a canvas for pain and fragility, was now a mask of cold fury. She was trapped, and she knew it. The first to move was Dr. Evans. He stood up slowly, the brochure for the assisted living facility still in his hand. He looked not at me, but at my mother, and his kind, gentle face was gone. In its place was the stern, disappointed expression of a medical professional who had been profoundly deceived. "Carol," he said, his voice low and heavy with implication. "I believe we need to schedule an appointment to have a very serious discussion about your long-term care and about the trust between a patient and their doctor." He placed the brochure on the table, a clear and final judgment. "I'll see myself out." He nodded curtly to me and left, closing the door softly behind him. With his exit, my mother's primary source of medical legitimacy vanished. Next were her friends. Martha and Joan rose from the sofa as if in a trance. They avoided looking at my mother, their gazes fixed on the carpet, the walls, anywhere but at the woman whose tales of suffering they had so eagerly consumed for years. We should be going," Martha mumbled, grabbing her purse. Joan just nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. They scurried out of the house without a single word of comfort or farewell to their dear, brave friend. Her fan club was disbanded. Her audience had left the theater. We were finally alone, just the two of us in the quiet living room, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 phantom illnesses. "So this is it then," she finally said, her voice dripping with venom. "After all these years, this is how you repay me. You humiliate me in front of my friends and my doctor." "Repay you?" I asked, the last of my fear giving way to a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Repay you for what?" "For the years I put my life on hold. For the relationships I lost. For the dreams I gave up because I thought you were dying? No, Mom, this isn't a repayment. This is a resignation. I quit. I am no longer your caregiver because you were never sick. She had no response. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a sullen, bitter defeat. I stood up and walked toward the hallway where my packed boxes were now stacked proudly, no longer hidden in shame. James is coming with the moving truck on Saturday, I said, my back to her. I'll be out by the end of the weekend. I expected a scream, a sob, a last-ditch attempt at manipulation. But there was nothing, only silence. I didn't look back as I walked to my room and closed the door. The next few days were spent in a tense, unspoken truce. She stayed in her room, and I methodically dismantled my life in that house, packing away the remnants of my childhood and the years of my arrested development. On Saturday, James arrived as promised. He looked at me, saw the new lightness in my posture, and smiled. "Ready to go?" he asked. I had never been more ready in my life. Our new apartment is filled with sunlight. It's small, but it's ours. The silence here is different. It's a peaceful, promising quiet, not an oppressive, waiting one. The first morning I woke up in my own bed, next to the man I love, I made coffee and stood on our small balcony, watching the city come to life. There were no sighs from the next room, no manufactured emergencies on the horizon. There was just the gentle hum of a new beginning. My relationship with my mother is now a barren, desolate thing. We speak on the phone once every few weeks. The calls are short, formal, and stripped of all emotion. She never asks about my new life, and I never ask about her health. We both know the truth now, and it stands between us like a wall of glass. I know that in her mind, I will forever be the villain of this story, the cruel, ungrateful daughter. But I have finally learned that her version of the story doesn't have to be mine. I didn't just move out of a house. I walked out of a prison she had built for me brick by brick, lie by lie. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I am free.